I'm going to move directly to Kelsey Galimba right now, who is joining us from Oregon State University. And Kelsey's an assistant professor of horticulture. Her program aims to optimize orchard production in pear and sweet cherry by improving fruit yields and quality. And so, Kelsey, I will hand that over to you right away just to get rolling. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, okay, great. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to talk today. So my name is Kelsey Galimba. I am a fairly new horticulturist with Oregon State University, and I am located at McCarrick, which is an experimental station in Hood River, Oregon. So I'm going to be talking about sweet cherry. Today's talks have been focusing more on apple. But here in Oregon, our crop that was hit the hardest was sweet cherry. First, I want to just explain a little bit about our region. So like I mentioned, I'm in Hood River. My program serves two counties, Hood River and Wasco County, here in the Mid-Columbia region. And this region is a really large tree fruit production area for Oregon. So we have 83% of the sweet cherry acreage in Oregon falls within these two counties, and 74% of the pear acreage falls in these two counties from Oregon. You can see on the bottom left here, we have different climates. So our climate shifts really rapidly as you move west to east, and that's because we're in the rain shadow of the Cascades. So Hood River gets a lot more precipitation than Wasco County, and that climate difference is really responsible for the dichotomy we see in the different crop types. So on the charts on the bottom right, Hood River produces mostly pears, and the numbers of pears we've produced has held steady over the last 20 years. Wasco County produces mostly sweet cherry, and again, the acreage of sweet cherry has held steady over the last 2 decades. So like everybody here, the Mid-Columbia was hit really hard by the 2021 heat dome event. So our pears really weren't affected. Pear isn't as susceptible to sunburn as apple is. And like Lee mentioned before, the pome fruits were a little bit earlier in development. So they didn't suffer as many effects from the heat, but our cherry crop was hit really hard. Most of our cherries were either right at maturity or right before maturity. They were particularly susceptible to heat, and we had a whole range of phenotypes. So all the way from browning to this just absolute shriveling or raisening effect. And a lot of our cherries didn't go harvested. They remained on the tree because they just weren't worth picking. So I am new to my position. I've been here a little over a year. I think that studying the effects of heat on sweet cherry is going to be something that is going to become more and more important as time goes on. I'm not a climate scientist. We've heard from some other people today who know a lot more about how the climate is going to change than I do. But I just wanted to share this briefly. In Oregon, we are forecasting to see higher temperatures as time goes on. So the top graph here is looking at 2 different RCP scenarios for the Pacific Northwest. We've got a moderate and then a kind of high emission scenario. With the high emission scenario, the RCP 8.5, we have an average projected increase of about 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the Pacific Northwest by 2050. We also expect to see an increase in the number of hot days. So if you look at a map of Oregon down here on the bottom, this is days from April through October with a heat index of over 90 degrees. Again, with that high emissions scenario, you can see the map gets hotter. The colors get darker as time goes on. We just expect to see more and more hot days. So an average increase in temperature and an increase in the number of days where we have abnormal heat. So my background is really in developmental biology. I did my PhD in flower development, and then I did a postdoc with the USDA looking at fruit development in a number of different fruit tree species. So I kind of wanted to spend some time talking about how abnormal heat or heat events can affect different stages of development, all the way from flowers to fruit in sweet cherry. And the idea here is that the 2021 heat dome happened right at maturity. That had a very specific effect on the cherry crop. But the potential for having these heat events, we could have them at any time of the year. We could have them affecting any point of development. So I kind of wanted to go over the different possible scenarios that we could predict. So looking at early flower development, so here on the left, we have pictures taken from actually a cold hardiness phenology chart. So looking at buds all the way from first swell through full bloom. I wanted to talk about this because, we don't expect to see temperatures over 100 degrees or, really hot in these early spring periods. But abnormal heat at this time does have the potential to impact yield, because if it gets too warm too quickly, all of this phenology happens a lot faster. Buds lose their cold hardiness too soon, and that sets them up for being at risk from subsequent frost events. Abnormal heat can also have an effect on the whole pollination, fertilization, fruit set process. So it can have a direct effect on pollinators. Curdy talked a little bit about effects on pollinators in the fall. It can also affect them in the spring. So if you have abnormal high temperatures in the spring, bees will preferentially forage for water resources as opposed to nectar or pollen, which can affect your pollination. Normal heat can also have a direct effect on the flower that affects pollination and fertilization. So if it's hot and dry, the stigma of the flower that needs to remain, moist and sticky can dry out too fast. The ovule, the amount of time that it's viable and able to be fertilized, gets shortened quite a bit when it's hot. And all of those factors can have a detrimental effect on fruit set. So hot temperatures, even early in the spring, when we're talking about flower development, can have an effect on fruit yield later on in the year. Switching gears and talking about development of fruit. So cherry, like other prunus species, the fruit exhibits a double sigmoidal growth curve. So it really develops in three different stages. Stage one, which kind of starts right after full bloom, is characterized by really rapid growth. So the mesocarp of the fruit, which is the fleshy fruit wall, grows really quickly. That's via cell division and enlargement. Then the fruit growth slows down in stage two. So during this period, other physiological events are taking place. The endocarp, or the pit, is lignifying, hardening. The embryo is developing. The fruit isn't growing as rapidly. After stage two concludes, the fruit goes into stage three, which is also known as final swell. Here, the mesocarp starts expanding rapidly again, and this time it's via cell enlargement as opposed to cell division. This graph is taken from a paper where they looked at these growth curves for 7 different sweet cherry cultivars. You can see they differ slightly for all of the different cultivars. So this is a cultivar-dependent curve. It's also very dependent on temperature. So there hasn't been a lot of research done specifically on the effects of high temperature to sweet cherry. You can find research where they've looked at other prunus species. So there's work that's been done on peach. There's been some work that's been done on sour cherry. We know that if you experience high temperatures in stage one, so in between full bloom and say about 30 days after full bloom, that will cause you to have smaller fruit at harvest. And the reason for that is that when it's hot in those first 30 days, the fruit development speeds up. The phenological changes are happening very rapidly, and the tree isn't able to actually allocate resources to those fruit fast enough. So it's like they're developing, they're moving to the next stage before they've reached their optimal size, and that will lead to smaller fruit at harvest. Hot temperatures during this period will also shorten the stage. So again, it's just speeding everything up. And that has an effect on harvest date. So you will have an earlier harvest. In stage two, if you have high temperatures, again, it speeds everything up. You have a shorter stage. That has an effect on harvest date. Fruit need to be picked earlier. Then when we get to stage three, high temperatures actually have an opposite effect. So in stage three, if you get abnormally high temperatures, you have a longer stage. There's actually a delay in maturity, and that will lead to a later harvest. Fruit, when they get to the end of stage 3, you know, when they're really close to maturity or at maturity, they're also really susceptible to heat damage that can affect quality. So that's what we saw in 2021. I want to switch gears and talk about some really quick and dirty experiments that we tried to do right before this heat dome event. So we had a few days warning. We tried to see, you know, what can we do to try to get some data out of this event now that we know that it's happening. So one of the things that we tried was to experiment with heat mitigation using kaolin clay or surround. Lee talked about using surround in apple. It's not typically used in cherry. And the reason for that is that it's hard to get off. It's impossible to get off of the cherries because you can't scrub them. The skin is too fragile. You're not able to remove the surround. So it's not typically used. We decided we were going to use it to see if it would work to help protect against the heat, and then also play around with some different ways to try to get it off using different detergents and surfactants. We had 9 trees that were treated with surround, 9 that weren't treated. We only had time for 1 application. We collected 100 fruit from each tree, and then we scored them using these different quality effects that were provided by Washington Tree Fruit Research Commission. So we scored bleaching, this cooked phenotype, we scored pitting, that shrivel or raisin-like appearance, soft shoulder and stem discoloration. And then we also scored suturing, which is just kind of a cell breakdown right along the suture. Long story short, we didn't see any significant statistical differences between the treated and the non-treated control. When we combined the damage into just kind of pooling it all together, again, we didn't see a difference. So I think what happened here was that it was likely mentioned, we reached 115 degrees here in Hood River. The surround, you know, is reflecting some of that solar radiation, but it's just not enough to combat such an extreme heat. I don't know that we are going to be following up on research with surround. Like I mentioned, we tried to play around with some ways to get it off. We weren't able to get it off at an adequate level. There was always some of the clay left on the cherry. We went so far as to consult with a chemist. They suggested maybe using a cationic surfactant or an amine to strip off the surround, but they warned that that might make the cherries smell like fish. So we didn't follow up on that. I think there are probably other chemical compounds or other products that could be applied that might work better than surround and not leave a white residue. We also did a really quick experiment trying some shade cloth. Here, I think we made a number of mistakes. So when we wrapped trees, you know, nobody here has the structures for shading cherry trees. We tried to wrap the entire tree. I think what we basically did here was we just trapped the heat within the shade cloth. There wasn't any airflow. We also had a number of points where the shade cloth was in direct contact with the cherry fruit. And basically what we did is we just cooked the cherries. So Ashley Thompson, who was collaborating with me on these 2 really quick experiments, you know, she made the comment that if you want to skip a couple steps in making cherry pie, just wrap your trees in shade cloth because everything was pretty well cooked. We saw less soft shoulder and less pitting in the shade covered trees. But I think that's very possible that those phenotypes were just kind of lumped in with the cooked phenotype. So we were just seeing so many cooked fruit. We weren't seeing the other categories here. So I do think shade cloth has some potential for, you know, for following up with research. I do think that it could be a way to help protect cherries. Again, probably if temperatures are hot, but not as hot as 115. I think we just had such extreme heat here that there's just not a lot of mitigation that could save a crop from those levels of heat. So with that, I'd just like to thank our McCarrick team here. I have my contact information here. I can definitely answer questions in chat for sake of time, but I would like to thank everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for the presentation. I think you gave us a really great perspective on what was happening in Oregon too, and there's certainly lots of crossover there. So if you have questions for Kelsey, I think there's one that's popped up. It's in the Q&A box. So we'll leave it there. Thanks, Kelsey.